Dr. Susie Bennett. It's so good to see you. Welcome back.
Well, I'm happy to be here, George. Obviously, I've said it before, but you and your audience were a massive part of this work, a massive part.
Well, we started off just as a DM in my inbox on Reddit. You were just a random Reddit handle. And I was like, this sounds great. What can we do? And I had no idea it would flourish into all the incredible work that you've done. I mean, it's selfish of me to take any sort of credit for that, but I feel like I get a lot of secondhand pride from what you've done. So I don't know how you feel. We must feel really proud. We should be. And I feel like our relationship and the work we've done is a really positive sign of what can happen in time.
A lot of time and a lot of care, I think, George, is the truth. I think we work well together because we share that root cause. Our intentions are rooted in that care. And that's really important for me, to be around people that absolutely have to share that. But actually it was a young guy in India that follows your account who contacted me on Reddit, said you need to go and speak to TheTinMen. Yeah.
It does feel like we are reaching a critical mass now. Like I've spent many years, it feels like talking to myself. In many ways I was talking to myself, just putting content onto a page, no one's responding, no comments, no likes. And then slowly you start meeting new people, you're making connections, and then you see those connections connecting with each other separately to you. How do you feel about the future? Do you feel like we are reaching a critical mass where people are finally talking about things like male suicide in a more meaningful way?
I definitely feel some seeds of positivity, for sure. I think it's still a fucking struggle, like financially. There's so much work, George, that we need to do. And like all of my research has taken a very broad approach to men. And of course, there's massive diversity in men, in the male experience. And there's still so many like really, really urgent questions that we have that don't have the funding. I'm kind of tired. Like I'm not emotionally tired. I want to get really serious in terms of like the financial support to really scale up what we can do and the questions that we can ask.
I don't want to go too much into your personal story, but it's always been a struggle for you to get funding. I still don't think you've received any funding from the government.
Yeah.
And considering all men in the UK, the biggest risk of their life is suicide every day until they're 50. I can't think of many bigger priorities for government than to stop men killing themselves at such insanely high rates.
I mean, it was interesting listening to what you're saying. I was just thinking, we've just done a piece of work because we're trying to develop some training for health professionals in male suicide. And we did a survey recently with, I think it was about 170 health professionals, and 96% of them have never had any training in male suicide, which, speaking to your point of it being the biggest killer of men under 50, is like really, that's fucking mad that 96% of the people we spoke to said we've never had specialised training in theirs, which is not to demonise those people at all. These people are working in a system that's so traumatising in some ways. For me, something like having a minister for men, I feel, and I know that people have different opinions on this, my personal opinion is it is so critical for my work. I have to have a place where I can go politically and say, this is what we're finding out. What are we going to do about it? Because my work involves people in extreme levels of psychological pain, entrusting in me really intimate realities of their life and their experiences and their histories. So for me to have like a designated political space that exists to try and improve the circumstances and conditions of men's lives is really, really important. Not only for my work is that valuable, but I think societally to make visible the idea that a lot of men are leading extremely difficult lives and have unique challenges that need a unique kind of bespoke response to them is really, really important in terms of us changing these sort of ideas we have of men being just a privileged, all-powerful group of people, which is not the reality for, lots and lots of men.
But that's why your work's so important, because male suicide, up until I met you, for me at least, was sort of like a meme. Like you'd get a few catchphrases and hashtags to better understand why men die by suicide. And if there's one thing I've learned in my journey is that there is no one single cause, and we may never know why a man died by suicide. Even the people closest to that man often don't know. I think most men don't even leave a note and leave behind a family that have no idea why it happened. So it's frustrating to talk to bereaved families who often have no idea why a man died by suicide, but then you log on to Instagram or Twitter and then some know-it-all has all the answers. And they're speaking on behalf of all men, and guess what? It's just one simple thing. It's toxic masculinity or something along those lines. I got into a little bit of a social media feud with someone that decided to speak on your behalf around your views on toxic masculinity, whether you're in favour of the concept as a phraseology or against it. He seemed to think that you were in favour of it. I know that you're not, but obviously I'll let you speak for yourself. So I would love to ask you, what are your thoughts on the concept of toxic masculinity?
I mean, I just find it such an unhelpful term. I mean, in my work, there's sort of two broad approaches to understanding suicide specifically in men. Why are men more at risk of dying by suicide than anybody else? And there's sort of two broad areas you can look at the biological differences between men and other people, and what may be the biological factors unique to men that may elevate risk for them, and then also look at the cultural factors. So how are the social norms and expectations we have around men and male behaviour potentially elevating risk for men, not just because of how men may be socialised to understand themselves, but how everyone else around them is also socialised to understand and respond to men. And that's the area that I look at. I can't speak to the sort of biological factors, though I absolutely think there's lots in there that's important. I try to really emphasise, because it's so important to me, that we are looking at external cultural ideas, things that exist outside of our bodies that, of course, our brains then absorb, and we internalize those ideas. And I'm not saying they don't impact our psychology, but the root of those ideas are things that live in the external environment. My work is never about saying that there's things inherent about you being a man that are harmful or dangerous to you. I'm talking about these cultural ideas that then are potentially internalized by certain men in a certain way that can be very harmful and dangerous to them. And so this idea of that there's something inherent about men and masculinity that's toxic, I think we both agree. I just don't see what's helpful, constructive about telling a group of people that there's something toxic about them. And also, what is the evidence to say that it is something inherent to men? Toxic ideas of masculinity,
Well, that's the answer for me. That's why it's so frustrating, because I often find that people that really make my life difficult by repeatedly making videos about me and how wrong I am, I often don't think they realise how much we are on the same page. And often talking about the same thing, but the way we're talking about it is different. It's a matter of tone of voice in many ways, which is like, thankfully, area of expertise and something I do know a lot about. Fundamentally, I don't think we can really do meaningful work for men, and especially vulnerable men, dealing with suicidal thoughts by starting on this base level of, well, let's just call them toxic. That is not a good starting point for a conversation, because you need to have compassion. Like, that's the therapeutic alliance. You need to have compassion for the person you're trying to help. And by calling them toxic is not helpful. And like you said, you're pointing the finger in the wrong direction. You're ignoring like the material conditions and environment around which dysfunctional performances of masculinity can manifest themselves. And you're blaming the man himself for basically being a sponge and ingesting those toxic attitudes towards masculinity. So like I said, the difference for me is not toxic masculinity, which says the toxicity is in here, toxic attitudes towards masculinity. Just the addition of those two simple words, you're turning the finger around, you're pointing out to society from which these toxic attitudes come from.
I agree, and it's hard to be sometimes kind of calm about it when you are sort of in direct dialogue with men in tremendous levels of pain, living incredibly difficult lives. Exactly as you said, like putting a label of toxic on top of those men is just deeply
dehumanizing,
offensive.
Dehumanizing, unhelpful, misdirecting, childish, I think. I mean, it's very frustrating. I know I sent you an article recently about male loneliness, which is something that you know a lot about. And I'm very interested in. Like, one of the most important risk factors of suicide is male loneliness and isolation. And I've seen articles which have shared with you that are talking about this thing called man keeping, where you're trying to, again, you're twisting the narrative And man keeping is basically the idea that lonely men are leaning disproportionately on their female partners, and therefore it's women that are paying the biggest price for male loneliness, because they're the ones that have to deal with the lonely men. And what goes through your mind when you read articles like that?
I mean, I haven't read the original study, so I need to make that clear. But I think there's a reality that there's certain relationships where, yes, women are being or feel like they are the primary emotional support for a partner. And that may be at times very draining and very difficult for them. I'm not denying that is a reality as well, but it's an inability, I suppose, to hold compassion for a human being who's been so starved of other emotional outlets because of cultural expectations around how they should behave, how they should conduct relationships, that is become the only space that they feel available to them to seek those things that all of us need in order to function and navigate life. So for me, it's the inability sometimes in how these things are framed to hold compassion for what is also the male experience in that, which is not to diminish what the woman's experience is, but also to allow for the fact that for me, there's a real societal and cultural violence that's happened to men to allow them to become so lonely and so isolated. That's fucking horrendous. We all know one of the worst punishments for people is
being ostracized.
Yes, exactly, or being kept in isolation and things like that. We need human connection. We need meaningful human connection. And I think that we have to start acknowledging the ways in which our societies and cultures can limit those possibilities for some men, whilst also acknowledging that there's a lot of men who provide a lot of emotional support and care for their female partners as well, that there's not one size fits all to this conversation. But yes, I think sometimes just as a general rule, it's this kind of us and them. You know, I want us to be able to hold what the woman's experience in a situation is alongside with what the male experience is, and having compassion for the context for those two people and the emotional realities for both of them. I sometimes struggle as well with terms like emotional labor.
Yeah.
Because I think it's very dangerous for us to insinuate that men are not having an emotional experience. Like, a lot of men I know are extremely worried and concerned about their relationship, their partner, things going on with their families, and their partners may feel like they're doing the emotional labor within the dynamic. But actually sometimes for men it's being internalized and not necessarily being expressed. But it's not to say that there isn't an emotional response happening, that there isn't distress happening. It's just potentially looks different or is expressed different. It's really important to me that we start to celebrate men as emotional beings. Like, it is a sort of fundamental property of existence that you have a feeling response to life. You're feeling something, I'm feeling something. And to socialize one group of people to have a less effective relationship with understanding what it is you might be feeling, and a less social permission to express that, because that feeling is giving you signals to tell you about your state of being, and it's really critical information in terms of choices that you might make about your life, relationships, things that you're doing. It's absolutely vital. I don't like this idea that getting men to talk about their feelings or to be in deeper relationship with their feelings, because for me it's not always necessarily about talking about your feelings, it's about talking to yourself about what you're feeling, improving that understanding of knowing for yourself. I don't like it when we sort of suggest that is making men more feminine by getting them to be more emotionally connected with themselves, because for me that's just a fundamental being a human being. It's about allowing men to embody their full humanity in that in the domain of emotions. So for me, it's really, really important how we talk about men as emotional creatures, and that we don't reinforce this idea that men are somehow emotionally limited. Because we've done studies about barriers to accessing professional support with men who are suicidal. And some of the men have said, I haven't gone for help because I don't think I've got psychological capability to utilize that help. I don't know how to talk about my feelings or express them properly to be understood. I mean, it's rooted, of course, in this sort of cultural ideas of male emotional suppression as well, but also in presenting men as somehow being emotionally limited, when the reality is, George, some of the most, as I've said to you before, the most emotionally enriching and insightful and meaningful conversations that I've had in my life have been with men who are suicidal. When you give them time and a space that's imbued with compassion to tell you about the things that have happened to them, incredible emotional insight and wisdom comes through. For some, in some ways, these are life's greatest philosophers because they've been thinking for a long time about what makes life meaningful and valuable. And I personally learned so much in terms of how I live my own life because I don't speak to men who are suicidal who say to me, I wish I had this job or this car or this amount of, material things. The things that they're craving are, intimate connection, purpose, meaning, feeling valuable, feeling that you matter, feeling that you belong. And it reminds you all of the time, in a way, of the things that make life
worth living.
Exactly. So there's huge emotional wisdom in men who are suicidal. At the same time, they are also often living with a legacy of harm because of these cultural ideas around how they're socialized towards their emotions. I've gone way off track on your question.
I'm enjoying your journey.
Yeah, so I just think we have to be very cautious about how we talk about men's emotions. And going back to your original point about this idea of man keeping, being able to hold both compassion for both the woman's experience in that and the man's experience as well. I think often about how women are socialized in relationship with their body and the amount of kind of insecurity that can exist for a lot of women because of the way that we've been raised in terms of body image, and that maybe a lot of female partners seeking a lot of reassurance from their male partners, about their appearance and wanting affirmation in that domain. We would, I think, hold compassion, or I'd like to think we would, and I would argue that we held compassion for both a man that may find at certain points that gets quite tiring, having to constantly affirm and reassure, but also for the woman that's filled with insecurity and doubt about that. I'm not saying that they're directly the same things, but it's that notion of what I'm trying to say about holding compassion for all the experiences that are happening in that dynamic.
I totally agree. I agree with all of it. It's the frustrating thing about man keeping, and for those who don't know what that means, it basically just means that a female partner is looking after her male partner and being lent on
emotional support.
The thing is that there's a certain truth to that. It's just, I don't like the way it's presented. It's like you're filtering a really important problem, but through like a very narcissistic point of view, where there is no doubt male loneliness has a secondary impact in women. But I wouldn't say that's the primary burden is not paid by women, but it's an important one nonetheless. I mean, I have my girlfriend has, say, complex needs, and there's a lot of emotional support that I have to do, and part of that's just being in a relationship and being a good partner, and that's just how it is. And if you don't like that, without calling it man keeping, I would say maybe you should ask if you're ready to be in a relationship, because that's what part of being a relationship is. I agree also with what you said about men being very emotional creatures. Very emotional, perhaps not in the same way as women, but no less emotional in their own way. I often, when people say that to me, I always just want to give them my phone and ask them to go through my DMs and read some of the messages I get just every single day from men, and just the emotional eloquence of such men and the wisdom and profound insight they offer. And that's where I really enjoy your work, because there's two things I sort of know about you. One is that as a researcher in suicide, you're very much of the belief that suicidal research for men needs to be centered on suicidal men and the male experience. But then the second thing about you is that you're not a man. You're clearly a woman. So how is that? What sort of obstacle is that? Do you think being a woman in male suicide is a disadvantage or an advantage, or is it both?
I think it's definitely both. And at the moment, there aren't many of us doing this work. And what I would absolutely love is, us to be talking in a few years' time and us to have researchers around the world, like And I mean that in so many different countries, looking at this in different contexts. And one of the studies we've done is to develop this, which again, your audience helped with, is developing this agenda of research priorities for male suicide. So we've got a list now of 22 questions that have been we've been told by people with lived experience, these are the most important things to start looking at.
Can we do like a generation game style thing where you just list them off? Like how many of those 22, or what are the top 5 research questions we should be looking into for male suicide research?
The number one voted priority. So we asked people with lived experience to rate the priority of 135 different research questions. And we took those research questions from studies that had sort of systematically synthesized all the evidence currently in existence, or as much as we could find, on male suicide, both published articles, grey literature, which is like charity policy reports, and then also data from big surveys that we've done with men who are suicidal. So we distilled from those sources 135 questions, and then we asked people with lived experience which are the ones that are most important. And the question rated as highest priority was around male loneliness and isolation and its relationship with suicide risk.
And so how widely endorsed was that by your...
98% of people said it was either highly important or essential.
So pretty much everyone involved with suicide research thinks loneliness is essential.
Question, yeah. The second one was around feelings of failure and male suicide risk. And the third one was around sources of emotional pain. So without taking us off on another tangent, I think I've spoken to you before about like every suicide being like its own individual symphony of sorrow. And you can never say as a suicide researcher what the violin player in the front row is playing, because it's unique to every individual person. Has had a unique life and they have a unique biology, and these different factors, all these unique factors, can contribute to that symphony of sorrow. So more broadly, I think what suicidal researchers can do is step back a bit and listen to lots of these different symphonies and start to think about what are the common sounds that we hear in the percussion, in the wind section. And so I started to think of it as us identifying core kind of psychological tectonic plates that sort of wrap around an individual like tank of psychological pain. So the tank of pain is individual to you, but we probably all share these core tectonic plates psychologically, and the functioning of these plates, the good functioning of those plates, enables us to live well. And our research kind of suggests that those 3 tectonic plates are about your relationship with your emotions, your relationship with yourself, so your thoughts and feelings about yourself as a human being, and then your relationships with other people. So what was interesting about those 3 priority questions is that they map onto those tectonic plates. The priority question about loneliness and isolation, it's about your relationship with other people. Priority question about feelings of failure is about your relationship with yourself, thoughts and feelings about yourself. And then sources of emotional pain is obviously about your relationship with emotions. So I think understanding how cultures socialize men to have relationships with those core tectonic plates, and understanding the additional pressure potentially because of that process of socialization is a really critical aspect of understanding male suicide, alongside lots of other things as well, of course.
But we seem to keep coming back to loneliness and isolation as one of many causes, but one of the bigger ones.
Yeah.
And it's like I said, it's very frustrating that the idea of male loneliness is sort of sneered at and mocked, and even more so like men's spaces, which are essential. I think I speak for both of us, essential in helping men feel connected with each other and building that camaraderie. Men's spaces are so often looked down upon or sneered at or vilified, and it's very frustrating that suicide is the biggest risk in my life. Loneliness is probably the most important risk factor attached to male suicide, and yet the antidote to loneliness, which in many ways is men's spaces, is so often vilified. It's like you're depriving me of the antidote to my own pain.
Yeah.
And it's so frustrating. Like the amount of times I've tried to open men's spaces, it's often shouted down. And I spoke on that seat right there about Rory, my friend who tried to set up a men's network at Loughborough University. And as soon as it got announced, it got just totally destroyed, like shut down. And I know it reminds me a bit of that when I did the panel on Friday with you, last Friday, and I had that question about what do you think about how men's loneliness impacts women? And I'm like, that's exactly the point now. It does impact women because these men's spaces are closing down, and panels like this that could be happening at universities and for men's networks, they're not happening because of people stopping it from happening, like banging pots outside, pulling fire alarms, and just basically harassing people like Rory.
Okay, yeah.
But going back to your research, one of the things I totally changed my view of men is, like you said, how emotionally eloquent they are. Because the research that we've done together, it's not like a little tick box exercise where it's like scored us out of 10, yes, no, give us your name, submit. It's like a half an hour long survey of huge qualitative sort of boxes to fill out your personal experiences, talking about probably the hardest thing you'll ever speak about.
Yeah.
Often things like childhood abuse and things like that. And the thousands of men that you reached that survey, they were giving you long, very eloquent, emotional waterfalls of their experiences. And that, again, is very counter to what we're taught about men, where they're not in touch with their emotions.
Yeah.
And then the amount of men that emailed me afterwards, and I think you got similar messages saying that's the first time anyone has ever asked me about these experiences. So there's a man who's gone maybe 30, 40, maybe longer years with these experiences, never told anyone about him being abused as a child. He finally arrives at a survey, and that's the first time he gets to speak about what he's gone through. And that, the amount of men that told me that, it broke my heart. And I'm glad that I've given them a space to talk about it, but it should not have been me. It should have been a therapist or a friend or a partner.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think about the point we were speaking about earlier about the importance of having a minister for men, because, it's when somebody is saying to you, this is the first time I've been able to share something like that, and they're telling you something that's deeply harrowing, that you will understand would have had a tremendously huge impact on someone's life. And this is the first time that they're sharing it. And now it's been given to me. And now what am I going to do with that? What can I do with that? That for me, that I need then the next step in the bridge to appear so that there's a place for me to take it. We know that challenges in childhood can be a big risk factor for suicide. A lot of that work has often been happened with female-dominated samples. We had a question around what does that look like for men specifically? And also then what is the pathway from difficult things happening in childhood to there being a sort of continued potential suicide risk? And I think that understanding that challenges in childhood are brutal for all people, but thinking about this potential double jeopardy for boys who experience pain in childhood and then are socialized as adults to deny that pain, suppress that pain. Where does that pain ever find sort of meaningful release in their lives?
What you're doing what sounds like you're doing is you're increasing the resolution of those male experiences.
Yes.
And you're sort of talking my language again, not seeing men as some static object, but more a man is the end product of a lifetime of experiences, many of them difficult and traumatic. And he's just shaped by his experiences like anyone else, rather than being inherently toxic himself. Yeah. He has just basically absorbed his experiences. Yeah. And even his behaviors. I know I'm blessed with so many followers, but I'll quote another one, Kath, I think she's a clinical psychologist working with children especially. And she's always said there were no abnormal behaviors, only a normal response to an abnormal set of experiences.
Absolutely. I think that certainly in the work that we've been doing, that I'm still writing about at the moment in terms of childhood experiences, is that a lot of what men are saying in a way is that there was a sense of unsafety somewhere in their childhood. Often that related to a sense that the care available to you was unsafe, or else there was a sense that you were unsafe. Something about you is unsafe for what the world is expecting you to be, whether that's something to do with your physical appearance that was getting bullied, about being neurodiverse, having a divergent sexuality from the mainstream, or racial identity that was the minority, or having mental health challenges, suicidal thoughts and feelings as a kid. There was an internalized sense seemed to be happening that it was somehow unsafe to be you. And then the third area was around other people not being safe. So really horrific stories about bullying and violence. It could happen from all kinds of different perpetrators. So peers, boys and girls at school, teachers, experiences of abuse, again, from all sorts of different perpetrators. But then if you're in an unsafe world, you have to learn strategies to survive that. As kids, we're building maps of understanding our environment, who we are in the world, whether we can trust other people, whether people can be relied upon, and whether our distress can be soothed by other people. All these maps that we're building all of the time. And if your environment, if there's a dimension of unsafety in it, then you're building maps to navigate an unsafe world, which then helpful for you in the sense of like you were in an unsafe situation and you have to learn to survive it. But as you transition out into what we hope would be a more safer situation at a certain point, you still are potentially relying on these maps to navigate and cope with an unsafe world. Intrinsic to all of that, in some ways, is how we learn to deal with our distress as children. A securely attached child who understands that their attachment figure is relatively consistent and present and available to respond to your distress helps you then to kind of co-regulate that distress. I start to learn that I can take my distress to another person and they will help soothe and calm me. And so not only am I learning that my distress can be co-regulated with someone else, but I'm also learning tools to self-soothe it for myself, so that as I grow and get older and those caregivers are not necessarily always available, then I have some framework for self-soothing. And often when I think of like people in suicidal crisis, they are some of the most distressed people on the planet. And the sources of that distress often have multiple kind of external roots related to your economic situation, or whether you've got access to your children, the state of your romantic relationships, all these other things. But you are the site where that distress is happening. And often in that moment of suicidal crisis, what you can be experiencing is a catastrophic failure in your ability to regulate your distress. So for me, there's lots that can happen in childhood that can be really relevant to suicide risk across the life course. And that is, of course, relevant to any human being, irrespective of gender. But when you start to think about how these cultural ideas of masculinity can also then interact with these factors, and then the potential, as I sort of said earlier, double jeopardy for men and boys who experience difficulties in childhood, then I think we can start to tease out the possibility of these elevated risks for men. I feel like I went on a massive tangent.
You've got to apologise for tangents. Yeah. They're wonderful to follow. It's another double jeopardy I found in a similar vein is that, I mean, something I relate to a lot is that my displays of emotions, especially distress, are perhaps a little bit harder to detect than they are for women in my life.
Yeah.
Often around crying, for example. I know our friend Ezra from Mind, he talks about crying and how he did a whole talk about how there's no biological benefit to crying in terms of that physiologically, but crying evolved, and humans are only animals to cry. Humans evolved to cry to signal distress in the hope that it brings help from someone else, that peer support. And I feel I just don't cry. Yeah. And instead of being blamed for not crying and seen as some sort of malfunctioning woman, I always try and encourage people to think about what sort of experiences would have taught me or anyone not to cry. If crying is a signal for help, to get help, why would I not cry?
Yeah.
And is it because I wasn't helped? And I guess it brings it back to the conversation of who is really the one that has to do the work. Because we keep telling men to cry, but if they're not getting helped, then crying isn't particularly a helpful thing to do.
I really cannot cry as well. George, I can't cry over big stuff in my life. I can cry watching the football, for sure. And when I say cry,
Why
for
is
me, I'll say to someone, oh, I had a big cry. And literally it was like 2 tears that came out. But for me, that is like a big cry.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, like I can watch the football, I can listen to the Liverpool fans singing "You'll Never Walk Alone," and it stirs an emotion in me. But when really stressful things are happening in my life or to people I love, I'm really worried about them, I can't cry. I get a migraine. I've literally spent times, George, on YouTube watching videos of like twins that were separated at birth and then reunited when they were 70 to try and like, because I know I need a cry and I'm trying to like get the tears out. So I'm trying to
Well-
like stimulate them. It's a learned pattern for me that, and so for me, I often try to say, I'm not so concerned necessarily about your emotional expression. Like that's for you to figure out what you need. It's about you. It's the internal emotional understanding. So that part of the relationship being strengthened. So you know for yourself, oh, I think this is what's happening for me. And then you can make a choice about what do you want to do with that information? Do you want to share that with somebody else? Does that need to come out in crying? There's so much diversity that it's difficult sometimes talking about men because I don't want to present that there's ever like a uniform way in which suicidal crises happen for men, or the ways in which men can start to manage those thoughts and feelings, because there's so much diversity and it's so individual. It does come out in our research the danger of that when a man who's in crisis goes to the doctor and talks about his pain in a very matter-of-fact, pragmatic ways, and the doctor's potentially been socialized and trained to perceive distress as being something that's much more heightened and emotionally expressive, and where there's possibly crying and things like that, and therefore the man in front of them has not been read as someone in crisis, even though that man was. So yes, we have to absolutely broaden our understanding of how distress can present itself.
Well, it's a bit like some of your research talked about how men often disclose suicidal intentions in a very matter-of-fact way, even like a joke, like a joke at the pub, like a man talking about killing himself. And it's so difficult, and it's obviously much easier to miss a joke about suicide than someone that might cry about it. I really want to cover some really important points that no one ever talks about, but suicide in the construction industry is something I never see spoken about. I find it very frustrating, as I guess I'd call myself an influencer, how many mental health influencers in this space are just sort of very economically powerful celebrity men that I would argue are not really the best people to be speaking about the average male experience on the street. The people most at risk of suicide aren't necessarily celebrity men. They are people that those work in construction. And I'm really keen to talk more about men in construction and how devastating suicide is, and why uniquely is construction and those sort of jobs an at-risk group to suicide.
I mean, there's been very little research into it, and that's unforgivable. There has to be, and I know people that are really keen to take on those questions and start looking at them. And again, it comes down to getting the funding to enable that work to happen. A lot of my friends work in construction, and I think about the isolation for those men working jobs where you don't see anyone all day. You maybe see somebody who lets you into the house, and then you're by yourself all day painting or tiling spaces. I think about the financial pressures they can be under, and then the impact that can have in terms of their thoughts and feelings about themselves, and feeling like you're a failure if you're not making the money that you feel or that you need to be making to provide for your family. I think also as men age and you're doing a very manual physical job
health.
And your body's starting to break, you can't do the work. It's causing you a lot of physical pain. The impact then on your sort of emotional tectonic plate, the worry and stress that comes of like, well, if I'm not able to do this job anymore, what can I do? This is all I've ever done. So I think that there's so many different, it needs really proper research. I'm kind of like just riffing with you now about some of the things like anecdotally that absolutely, for me, that's one of many real priorities. And I think as well, there's for me, a government responsibility here, because I was at a roundtable about suicide in the construction industry, and someone said to me that the government is the biggest contractor of construction works because of all the railways and the buildings and the schools and hospitals. So actually, if I'm the person that's
the employer,
the biggest employer in an industry that's killing men at the highest rates, then for me there is some government responsibility here around. I need to start funding the research to understand why this might be happening and what we can do about it. I think they're called the Lighthouse, which is an organisation for mental health and construction, and they do some really amazing work and some great people. And there's a great campaign at the moment. I think it's called Lost City.
Yeah.
By the On the Tool have started. So I love seeing the construction industry being like, we're going to take care of our own and start spotlighting this issue and thinking through what kind of support can be put in place.
It reminds me a little bit of, going back to crying, I think it's Tom Walt's History of Tears. He wrote about crying and how crying was originally a very masculine thing to do. That was totally normal for men.
Right.
You'd have like the Battle of Iliad, where men are crying, and crying was seen as a very noble part of samurai culture, like right through the history all around the world, until the Industrial Revolution arrived.
Okay.
And that's when it stopped. And it's, the idea is like, if a man's working in the factory, he's there to be productive. He hasn't got time to be crying and chatting about his emotions. So I wonder whether that is also relatable to construction, where if you're standing on some scaffolding, trying to do some roofing, you can't be chatting about your emotions because you're in a life and death situation.
Yeah.
But another thing I want to talk about is another at-risk group that I never see spoken about, and that's gambling. I just could not believe the stats. 400 deaths, suicides related to gambling in the UK every single year. So have you looked into gambling? What do you think, even intuitively, what's going on there? Why is it pushing so many people to suicide?
The way I describe it, and I think I've described it to you before, is to imagine that each of us has like a tank of psychological pain that we carry around, that different experiences in our life, kind of, if you imagine an exposure pipe at the top of the tank, and different experiences in life pour pain into our tank. And then there's a regulation pipe at the bottom, which should help us move pain out of the tank. And the thing about when you're in pain is you don't want to be in it. You're seeking ways to get relief from pain. And so a lot of men that I speak to have kind of high exposure to pain, and then a lack of effective tools to regulate that pain meaningfully, and can end up using these pain relief behaviors, ultimately pouring more pain into your tank. So things like gambling, drink or drugs, or self-harming, fighting, sex, porn. I think there's huge stuff going on with men and food and eating disorders. I think is really under the radar at the moment. So I think gambling for certain men can be this sort of pain relief behavior that helps you feel something different than the distress. It's then linked, with impulsivity. I'm sure that once we start looking at properly, the possibility of like a crossover with neurodivergency and ADHD. I know loved ones who are gambling addicts, and I think we don't hold gambling with enough sensitivity around the legacy it can lead on human lives. Like, it's really difficult as a big football fan for me. When I see football players like promoting,
I think like 50% of football clubs are connected to some sort of gambling. It's so widely advertised. Ties into that fear of failure thing. Because you feel like a failure, you've done it again, you've got rid of all your money. What's your wife or girlfriend going to say? But it's very interesting what you said about the coping mechanisms that many men use to regulate their emotions, be it gambling or drinking or food or sex, porn. Not only are they not helping, but they're actually exacerbating the problem.
And you can see certain men sort of describe getting trapped in these sort of cycles of pain, of feeling a high level of pain, seeking relief from that pain through behaviors that are ultimately compounding the pain. And so the pain in your tank's just getting higher and higher. And for some men, if you've got high exposure and your regulation pipe isn't working effectively, then that pain is going to build until you reach a threshold for some men where it no longer feels bearable.
Just wrapping it up, Susie, one of the problems I've seen as well in researchers, and this is quite speculative of me, but it seems like a few large researchers and think tanks that I know seem to be wanting to look into male suicide, but only within the context of homicide, suicide. So a man who kills often a partner or even a family and then kills himself. Obviously there's a tragic, but it's very frustrating to see people concentrate on that as the first port of call, when that's such a small percentage of the larger problem. But how do you feel about people centering suicide research on homicide, suicides?
I would be so deeply concerned if that were to happen. In my research, it's I mean, I've never had an experience of that. I think what makes me so uncomfortable about it is that we start to build an association between people's mind that if I say to you, I feel suicidal, that you're going to start to think, are you going to kill your partner and children? It's so far removed from what the majority of suicidal people need somebody to be thinking. The main thing I experience in talking to men who are suicidal is deep pain, deep sadness, deep grief for their lives, for the things that have happened to them, when they think about their futures. And like, there's so much compassion required there, so much tenderness and a need for understanding that that for me is such a dangerous kind of route to go down, and not a reflection of the reality of the majority of men that I speak to. I'm not saying that it isn't something that needs to be looked at and understood, but on its own terms, separate to what I experience as the majority of people men who are suicidal, who never speak in the languages of wanting. In fact, a lot of our research, a lot of men say to me about the worry they experience and the pain they're going to cause to others if they do kill themselves, but that at certain points that pain feels so intolerable they don't feel like they can endure it anymore. So yeah, I think that would be a very dangerous thing for us to center as in suicide research, given all the other things that are so important for us to be looking at that aren't being looked at, aren't being funded.
I read some research from Australia, and it basically asked men why didn't they take their life. They wanted to, but something changed their mind, and they asked the men, and I think the first 3 causes were, I didn't want to leave my family behind. I didn't want to burden people. I didn't want to hurt. Every single reason, the top reasons why they're not dying was to spare someone else, concern for others. And then there are certainly men that do kill partners and then kill themselves, but there are so many more that would want to protect their partners and often kill themselves. That's the main threat of a suicidal man, is obviously to himself, not to those close to him. The last thing I want to talk to you about, Susie, is another thing I never seem to speak about, and I feel like I might be guilty of this, is that although male suicide is just an enormous mountain-sized problem, there is actually an even bigger problem beneath that. And that is the many more men that are living in misery, who haven't attempted or completed suicide, but are still living with these things nonetheless. It's a bit like suicide is a very real flare that goes up in the sky, and you can't ignore it. It's huge. Someone's died, and it's frustrating that that's the one time we switch on and we actually right, what's happened here? This is not right. But before that, there was a lifetime of misery, and beneath that is a huge group of men who are living life in misery, who have not attempted suicide but exist there nonetheless. So I'd just love to know what might you say to those men listening that are living life in many of these ways, to help them understand their feelings, what they're going through, and perhaps offer them a little bit of hope for the future.
I mean, I think you're right that certainly deaths by suicide in a way is the tip of the iceberg, and underneath that you've got all the men that make an attempt, all the men that are living with thoughts and feelings about suicide. You've got all the families bereaved by suicide, all the loved ones that are caring or worrying about someone in suicidal crisis. I get lots of messages from lots of people, but also women, mothers, partners, girlfriends who are worried about a man in their lives. A lot of people are going to find themselves on the front line of a suicidal crisis because of it's happening to someone that you care about and someone that you love. Anyone that comes in, listens to me talk, knows that I absolutely love and adore community interventions, peer support. George, I love men taking care of each other.
Yeah.
I absolutely love it. And I see it happening all over the place. Quite big organizations now, like Andy's Club, Talk Club, but on Instagram, there's so many sort of smaller community groups, just even like individual men doing walking and talking, trauma support, cold water swimming, military football clubs. There are women like Mel that have created support groups for men. So I find that so kind of beautiful and encouraging. And I always say, in no way do I think suicidal pain is an illness or a disease, but I think about other things that are killing people at high rates, like cancer or heart disease. And I think we're at the limits of what we understand medically of our medicine in terms of responding and dealing with those sorts of things. when it comes to suicidal pain, some of the best medicine that we have is love and compassion. You have that in abundance. I have that in abundance. Every single human being that's listening to this has that medicine inside of themselves. So yes, sometimes when you look at the scale of this and you think about all the structural and cultural things that need to change, you go, oh my God, it's overwhelming. And then I ground myself in the individual expressions of that medicine that are happening all around, and like small fires of hope and comfort, like metaphorically firesides where people can gather and get heat and get connection and get social and emotional comfort and warmth from those spaces. And I think that's where I want to put my time and attention and sit with those fires with those people. And it gives me a purpose and tremendous hope. Yeah. Try and find that light, try and find those fires wherever you are, and sit in the spaces where there are people like I said, there are so many people that deeply care about this and are deeply concerned about it.
Well, that's another thing I've learned from you is, and just generally from my reading, people wanting to move past the whole biomedical model of suicidal pain, where often people think suicide is some sort of chemical imbalance inside your heads, whereas often for a lot of men it's out there in society putting stress on them. Many of the reasons we've discussed, but many more we haven't had time to talk about. So if the problem is out there rather than in here, then surely the solution is also out there too. And we are, like you said, the antidote to each other's pain. And you find that antidote for many people in these spaces like Andy's Man Club, Talk Club, etc. I've been to them and I've been quite cynical of them. And I always try and go as a third party observer. But I always get involved. I always get drawn in, and then I can't believe it's a bit like, I always think about it like a clown pulling napkins or serviettes out of his sleeve. It's a bit like the words that's come out of my mouth and I just can't seem to shut up. So I'm a big believer, especially in the context of how little the government are doing. Like there are so many people doing work for free, including like everyone in this room, and they're still doing it nonetheless. They're still here, and that's representative of how much people care, despite it not being a financial reward.
So many men who are suicidal want to help other people.
Yeah.
So many people who've taken part in my studies, not because they're getting anything necessarily out of themselves, but because they want to document their experiences in the hopes that it helps reduce the pain for somebody else in the future. I think things like those Annie's Club, Talk Club are so powerful as well, because not only is it a space for men to share in with other men, but you also get the experience of that reciprocal. I also get to feel like I'm helping by listening to somebody, by giving them space and encouragement and everything else. So there's this real, I think, desire amongst many men who are suicidal to be helpful to other people. And that also is something that we need to find more and more kind of understand as this beautiful natural resource and find ways in which it can be meaningfully expressed in the world.
Totally agree. And like I said, I'm not expecting a Minister for Men to come along anytime soon. I always like to say the person in the seat shouldn't even be me. I'm not qualified. I'm a Bachelor of Art. I'm not a PhD. I don't feel qualified to be in here, but I'm still here just because at least I qualified by caring enough.
Yeah.
And I'm still doing my best. I feel like in many ways that is good enough.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. Qualified by caring enough. And I think that's true. There are so many people out there that are doing magical things because of their qualification is caring enough.
Yeah, well, I'll use a great bit of advice I got from my friend Chris Williamson. Now, I can't take credit for, but he just said, if you think of someone during your day, send them a text message.
Yeah.
So if you think of Ezra, I've spoken about Ezra, then send him a text.
Yeah.
Be like, hey Ezra, I just thought of you and thought of checking how you're doing.
Yeah.
And if everyone did that, we may not even need a Minister for Men. Now that might get us the way there. Like, who knows how much good that could do if we just reached out a little bit more and said, Susie, I'm thinking of you. Elliot, I'm thinking of you. And just did a bit more of that, because politicians aren't going to do it themselves. Anyway, I'd just love to close off and ask you about your journey. Like this journey between you and I started with like I said, a little Reddit handle, an email from you. And now you're sat in a studio surrounded by cameras having a podcast with me. That has only been a few years. And you've done amazing work between then and now. Like you've been published in the most prestigious journals in the world, the equivalent of receiving an Oscar in many ways. And I hear you talked about everywhere, and it's been no time at all. It's been like that. So what do you see the journey like going forwards for Dr. Susie Bennett? And what's it going to be like when we meet again for our next conversation?
It's funny because I definitely struggle with my own mental health for sure, and I have to like manage my feelings and manage my self-esteem on a daily basis. So it's funny to hear you say all of that stuff because I look at it from a different context, I suppose. But for me, the reason I did this work was I wanted to get better information into the hands and lives of people living this reality so that they could understand better for themselves what's going on for me and have better tools then to navigate it. That was the entire reason that I've done this for. So I do a lot of work with Instagram and things like that to create that kind of content. And then I got this email from this lovely guy I met who runs his own men's group, and he's taken that work and he's kind of like re-expressed it in the language that works for his audience. He's like, these ideas really resonate with me and the men that I meet, and now I'm expressing them in a language that's going to be even more accessible for them. And I thought, this is the greatest gift I could have been given. I felt so kind of moved by that and happy about it because it's like you're part of the food chain of information and knowledge, and to see that kind of potentially being moved on further along the chain to other people, it made me feel kind of. But George, we need to get fucking serious, and I want to meet next time I meet you. I want some serious money.
Okay,
I want some serious.
I'll get saving that. Well, from me?
No, I mean, like, there's so much. The things that we've talked about today. It's not okay to keep saying to you, we don't know.
Yeah.
Someone needs to do research about that. We know the questions that we need to ask. We know the groups that we need to look at. Like I say, I want some people to. I'm not just talking about the government, but big corporations with loads of money.
Well, let's say I've got 5 blank checks here for you.
Yeah.
To who am I signing them and for what research?
George, there's so many things that we could. I mean, even things that we've just discussed today about suicide in construction, gambling,
porn, sex, food,
loneliness, feelings of failure, emotional stress, the impact of racism, neurodivergency. There's like so many things that we need to start really getting serious about investigating. So I want to see a lot of money being supporting this research because, George, until you talk to the people living a reality to understand what their experience is, what's happening, and what do you need to make things different, that's where the work needs to happen, in those conversations, in rooting it in the lived reality. So that's why research is so important, to evidence those realities and evidence the solutions that might be impactful. So I want to see a lot of money getting put into this. And then, like I say, I would love to help facilitate and inspire researchers around the world to also be able to access the resources to start investigating these questions in their context as well.
I hope that we can give you some of that money. It's such a strange feeling whenever I speak to you. It's hard to describe. It's a bit like I learn so much, but simultaneously I feel like I know nothing. I feel like I learned a lot, but I also there was so much I don't know. And I feel like that's a very honest thing to say. I often don't know, but I'm just trying my best, and that's just, I feel like it's more an indictment of the fact that there's no one else doing it.
Yeah, I do have to shout out, like we've sort of mentioned it as well, but there is this whole movement of people in their communities, like ordinary people, saying this isn't good enough. Often people that have lost people or had their own like suicidal pain that they've had to navigate, just saying, I got to start doing something about this now in my own community. And fucking thank God for those people.
I get that every week.
Yeah.
Like, I get someone that wants to chat to me. I've seen this. I've decided to do something. I've got 2 boys or a friend. I want to do something. And I get that all the time. And I feel like even the people that message me, there's many more that have messaged me that want to do it nonetheless. So I find that rewarding as well. But we shouldn't be doing it for free, and the government or whoever just need to start signing some big checks for this incredibly important but ignored issue. So how do we follow you on this journey, Susie? How do we give you this money that you're talking about?
The main space to follow me is on Instagram at male_suicide_research, where I try when I have time to post content about the research findings, try to make the information as accessible as possible. And when we're doing events and talks, I'll put it on there. So, yeah.
Well, I love your Instagram.
Thanks so much.
If my opinion means anything, I really enjoy it. I think you've got a hidden talent for creative communications that is so far beyond what I've seen in other researchers. Like I said, researchers and communication skills are very separate things, in my opinion. People that do research are very normally poor communicators, but then I talk to you and I'm like, wow, you not only on Instagram, but you speak so eloquently and thoughtfully and creatively and obviously passionately about suicidal men. So highly recommend following male_suicide_research.
Yeah.
And until next time, thank you for your time, Susie.
Thank you, George.
Dr. Bennett. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.